Welcome to This Week in Morgan County. I'm your host, Russell Mokhiber. Our guest again this week, Sarah Chayes, and we're back on corruption, but this time corruption in the USA. In the first part, you talk about corruption around the world. You came back to the United States and you worked in the what I call the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yeah, exactly.
In DZ,
right.
At what, Carnegie?
Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
What were you doing there?
Well, that's where I was really expanding. So I wrote Thieves of State there, and then I was pushing that research further to really examine the structure and operating principles of kleptocratic networks in other countries. So, I had this deep experience of Afghanistan, but then I looked at a dozen other countries, from Honduras to Azerbaijan to, Moldova to Serbia to, Burkina Faso, And so I was really trying to test the hypothesis that there's a pattern here. And then, there's a last chapter in Thieves of State called Self-Reflection. And I was loading a lot into Thieves of State by saying that violent religious extremism is actually related to governmental corruption, not religious ideology. That was a big thing to try to say. So I didn't want to load this book down with too much controversial analysis, but I did have a little chapter at the end that looked at Iceland, Ireland, and the United States in the lead up and following the 2008 financial disaster, saying that a lot of the things that I was identifying in developing countries were visible in the West, and that if we weren't careful to try to put some constraints on systemic corruption in the West, we were going to suffer the same kind of extremist uprising that could take who knows what form, but that we were susceptible to some kind of extremist uprising. Now, that book came out in 2015. I thought there was a little bit more time. I didn't expect a version of an extreme reaction so quickly, but that's what I feel we got in this country in 2016. I feel that a lot of the vote, certainly for Bernie Sanders, where it's very explicit and coherent, both the argument that he was making and the solutions that he was proposing, and also the vote for Donald Trump was one of these wrecking ball, smash the system, anti-corruption votes. Paradoxically, what we came out with, in my view, is not just more of the same, but actually a doubling down on the type of corrupt practices that made a lot of people indignant. But believe me, go to Maiduguri in Nigeria and talk to people who supported Boko Haram. They woke up with smashed heads too, and I've done that, and sort of 4 or 5 years later, they were like, well, Boko Haram was telling the truth about the problem, but their solution wasn't the right solution, so they regretted 4 or 5 years later having supported Boko Haram. And I feel like the same thing is the case here, that people made an extreme vote, and I don't know that they will regret it, but I believe, in my view, the person who gained the presidency is producing almost a distillation of the very corrupt system, of precisely the corrupt system that people were voting against. And while in the United States we don't have, police officers or doctors stopping you at the emergency room and saying, pay up or I won't, examine your wounds. That doesn't happen in America. But the kind of overlapping network corruption where you have, for example, we've got the heads of several we've got the Secretary of Treasury under this administration and the last administration came directly out of the industry that was profiting off of, out of the financial services industry. You've got that kind of overlap between the private sector and the public sector, and then you get deregulation, which helps not the public interest, but rather helps the banking industry. You've got somebody who believes in privatizing education, meaning making the education of our children into a venture whose objective is to maximize profit for the owners of education companies, rather than the objective of our education system being to best educate our children, you've got her running the education department. You've got, the head, you had the head of the largest corporation in not sure anymore it's the largest corporation in the world, but certainly the largest fossil fuel corporation, whose bottom line depends on being able to obtain sweetheart deals for oil exploration in kleptocratic countries abroad, like Nigeria or Angola or Russia or you name it, the head of our State Department. You have somebody who is deeply invested in the transportation of fossil fuels, the international transportation of fossil fuels, the head of our Commerce Department. In other words, you have a confusion of roles between people whose primary motive is to enrich themselves and their board members and their friends, who are now playing roles in government where ostensibly they ought to be protecting ordinary American citizens from the excesses of those types of corporations. And instead what they're doing is actively and energetically bending their agencies, bending the laws to favor the amassing of more money by the people who already have a lot of money, and to make it more difficult for ordinary people to bring their numbers to bear, because that's what ordinary people have to put in the balance. The 0.1% has their money to put in the balance. We have our numbers to put in the balance, but that is becoming harder and harder to do.
Right. And this is your new book. Your new book's about this, and what's the working title of your new book?
Kleptocracy in America. I don't know if it'll stay that, but de Tocqueville, that French scholar, French, in a way, sociologist, back shortly after the American Revolution, came and went on a tour around America, and he was very struck by the egalitarianism of our system and by this really revolutionary kind of self-government, as flawed as it was, and with as many poison pills that were embedded in it, like slavery, like women don't count as people, like, property owners only are the people, and people who don't own property don't get to vote. I mean, all of that stuff that, nevertheless, at the time it was revolutionary. So he came around and he wrote this very, lasting book called Democracy in America. And so I feel like we're now living in an age of kleptocracy in America.
And you moved to one of the poorest states in the country, West Virginia.
Yeah.
Why did you move here?
I moved here because I love the Potomac River, and so I moved into the Potomac watershed. That was the primary reason I moved onto the Kakapo River, which flows into the Potomac. But I also feel extremely comfortable in West Virginia. I feel extremely comfortable. The level of poverty in West Virginia is obviously something that I've experienced with most of my professional life. I am suspicious of the level of comfort that Americans have decided is a baseline, because I think needing that level of comfort and convenience almost automatically enslaves you to the corporations that are providing it, enslaves you to this economy where you have to, work yourself to death, at crappy jobs that you hate in order to have a kind of level of material comfort and convenience that actually is probably poisoning you. And so I actually feel comfortable. This sounds very strange because it's a choice. I understand it's a choice on my part, but I feel comfortable with the level of discomfort that there is in West Virginia, and I especially resonate to the rugged self-reliance of West Virginians, the beautiful combination of independence and interconnectedness, interdependence. There's a kind of independence that is bolstered by just an amazing instinct to help your neighbors, to watch out for your neighbors. My neighbors don't come over to see me ever without bringing something in their hand. People notice whether I was at another neighbor's house and another neighbor of ours said, your window was open the other day. You notice and you take care of and you watch out for. And there's a level of self-sufficiency based on, an understanding of the land and what's on the land and what's under the land. And what distresses me so much is that our polarized politics, and I would say it's, the fault is on both sides, frankly. Why is it that we can't get left-leaning environmentalists and right-leaning hunters who both adore our West Virginia wilderness, our landscape, and yet because of the way we've been driven apart from each other by the top of the kleptocratic system, which is activating our cultural divides as much as possible to make sure that overeducated, liberal environmentalists who wear tie-dye are unable to speak with and sit in the same room with undereducated, impoverished West Virginia hunters and who are making a lot of their subsistence off of their vegetable gardens.
The state went overwhelmingly for Trump, in some regions 80-20, and his was based in a sort of anti-corruption campaign. He talked about, the bank scandal. He talked about the bailouts. He talked about Hillary's ties to the banks. Lock her up was a theme. It was corruption written all over it.
Yes.
And this plays into what you found around the world.
100%.
Extremists running against corruption, even though often they're just as corrupt as the people they're replacing.
Yes, and you made a really great point before, which is that it doesn't matter the color of the regime. It can be just as corrupt. I have seen kleptocratic governments that are, call themselves socialist. I've seen ones that are uber, hyper free market capitalist governments. I've seen military dictatorships that are kleptocratic. West Virginia was a single party state for a long time. It was a democratic single party state. Illinois is a democratic state. These are both, they were incredibly corrupt democratic regimes. And so people are only offered two choices, right? And so at some point someone comes in saying, I'm Republican, and they're saying, well, the Democrats are this corrupt, therefore let me vote for something else. So that's part of it. It was also clearly a, I want to say very expressively anti-establishment campaign that President Trump ran, and explicitly, as you put it, against very obvious manifestations of corruption in the Democratic Party, which the Democratic Party, frankly, did not pay enough attention to, and still does not, frankly. But there's something else I'd like to point out. I just went out canvassing in the western part of the state, in Ritchie County, with a candidate for local office, and 70% of the people that we spoke to knocking on doors, and we knocked on every single door, don't vote, don't want to vote, aren't voting. If you do the map of West Virginia, where you map who voted for Trump, who voted for Hillary Clinton, and who voted for nobody, meaning they either chose not to vote or didn't vote, or they didn't even register. So I'm talking the electorate, the eligible voters. I mean, Mr. Nobody beat everybody, hands down. So when you're looking at, wow, Trump carried it over Clinton, that's one thing. But who absolutely destroyed both of them was Mr. Nobody. And that, to me, is also a very strong indication of people's disgust with the rigged system, is they didn't fall for, Clinton didn't address the rigged system problem. Trump did, but most West Virginians didn't fall for him.
I was listening to NPR this weekend, and they were interviewing one of the women who was protesting and engaging with Senator Joe Manchin. Mm-hmm. And what are you going to do? And she was asked in November. And she said, well, we really don't have a choice because our Attorney General is so bad, we have to vote for Senator Manchin.
Wrong.
You will not vote for Senator.
I will not
What are
vote
you
for
going to be
Senator
doing?
Manchin.
What are you going to be doing?
I intend to write in, and I'm not going to write in a specific candidate because I want to resonate with that huge body of Mr. Nobody West Virginians. I want to write in no more Manchin-crats. No more Manchin, and everything he represents, which is somebody who puts a D label on their shirt, takes people's votes for granted, like this woman who was interviewed, and behaves as the lackey of the private sector members of the kleptocratic network that's running this state and running this nation. And that means big pharma and big fossil fuels. His votes are always to benefit those guys. And he spends, I would love to see his calendar and see how much of his time he spends schmoozing, talking, hearing the perspectives of, eating dinner with, hunting with, hanging out with, drinking booze with, either lobbyists or executives of big pharma, of which, you know, he's one. I mean, he's not an executive, but he's bought in, right? You know, in the family. And of fossil fuel interests. And I'm sorry, but he is a human being like everybody else. He is influenced by what he hears the most from and what he identifies with personally. And given that his family, I mean, he's a perfect example of the kleptocratic network I'm talking about. You've got one family member who runs the principal business, one of the principal businesses in the American kleptocratic network, which is Big Pharma, and you've got him in Congress and running the state, you know, party apparatus, pushing for bills, eroding opposition to bills that favor the network, meaning favor Big Pharma and big gas, at the expense of us and the safety of our children and the air that we breathe and this wild, wonderful landscape that we all love, to turn it into some industrial wasteland.
So let me understand this. The Senate is in balance. Manchin could be this election in a month could decide whether the Senate is controlled by Republicans or Democrats. If there's another resignation from the Supreme Court, whether Trump gets to nominate someone else or whether the Democrats can block it. But you're saying, I'm not willing to vote for Manchin, and I'm willing to risk that. And why?
Here's
what
why.
makes? Yeah.
Yeah. Here's why. So, I want substance, not letters. You know, we tend to judge everything by numbers these days. So we say, okay, Manchin, D after his name. Let's get enough Ds, and then we can worry about getting good Ds. And I'm like, a D who doesn't represent the people of the state of West Virginia isn't, I don't care if he's a D. Again, it's like, I don't care if this sports team wins or that sports team win, it doesn't change the quality of my life. And I actually think he is standing in the way. West Virginia has an unbelievably powerful and glorious populist past, and I mean populist in the best sense of the word, where ordinary people banded together to fight the abuse of the coal companies or, you know, various other concentrated, you know, the couple people who concentrated the wealth. What I'm afraid of is that by standing there as a D, what Manchin is actually doing is preventing West Virginians from coming together to reimagine what a populist party that really cares for the people ought to look like. So he's doing an even greater favor to the Republicans by preventing the development of a real people-oriented party. And I think, so the question of how many Ds are there going to be in the Senate in 2018 is actually a tactical question. We got where we are today in this country because a bunch of the kleptocrats started thinking about how to do it back in 1973. And then they really started going into overdrive in the early to mid 80s. This has been a 30-year project to get us where we are today, we're not going to flip it back in a year. Now, I'm a little bit worried because I don't feel like the world has as much lead time as it used to. I think the damage that this kind of governance is doing to people, and especially our landscapes and the water and the air and the atmosphere and the climate that we all need to live. I don't think we have 30 years to fix this. But until we get ourselves straight about what's going wrong here, having more Ds who are essentially also in servitude to the very same corporate interests as the Rs are isn't going to make a difference. Let me give you one example. For me, the biggest event that happened during the 2016 campaign wasn't even the email dump. I mean, at the time, I didn't know about the degree of Russian subversion of the electoral process. It wasn't even the Access Hollywood tape, and the stunning things that then candidate Trump said. For me, the biggest event that happened in 2016 was the 8-0 Supreme Court decision overturning the corruption conviction of former Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell. I wasn't completely shocked that the conviction was overturned. What floored me was that it was 8-0. And it was 8-0 with no, concurring opinion written by one of the justices who felt that their vote had to go that way, but wanted to explain what the potential implications were for the integrity of the United States political system. I listened to NPR that day, and it was Diane Rehm, and she carefully chooses a spectrum of commentators. All of them said that they would have voted with that decision. What I'm trying to say here is that the establishment, be it D or R, is all infeuded to these corporate interests and has made its peace with pay-to-play politics. So until we can undo that, as far as I'm concerned, I don't care what letter is after someone's name. And I think we, the people, should start thinking about what does the rigged system really mean to us? And I've been having these conversations in a number of places. I'm just back from Lexington, Kentucky, where I had one of these conversations with just some regular folks in town. And the consensus I'm getting is that it's the role of money in politics. It's the ability, this overlapping of private and public sector that I was just talking about, that people go from being corporate executives to being government officials in the same area, and then they go back at a higher salary to being executives of the same corporations whose, interest they served when they were in government. Some people call that the revolving door, those two things are very, very central to people's concerns about why our system is rigged. And so I feel that we all need to band together, irrespective of the D or the R or the color after our name, and kind of have a pledge, right? Like the No New Taxes pledge or the pro-gun or anti-abortion pledge, whatever. Let's have a pledge that says we won't vote for any candidate on the right or on the left who doesn't make a small donor pledge, who doesn't pledge to change the laws on lobbying in this country. Let's make it pretty simple. And that's a way of bringing our numbers to bear instead of us always making compromises with people like Manchin, because he's got a D after his name. And okay, so he belongs to the corporate interests who are going to destroy my water, destroy my landscape, destroy the working conditions, keep minimum wage low, all of the things that people need. Destroy my property rights. I mean, he's in favor of laws that say that I don't have the right to prevent people from coming onto my private property to survey it for their corporate interests. I mean, so I don't know what that D means.
Well, on that question, in the 19th century, there wasn't a party representing the anti-slavery movement, and that gave birth to the Republican Party. Are we going to see anti-corruption force outside the two-party system rise to challenge both of them?
I would love to see that. As I say, what I've seen elsewhere in the world is that too often it's the demagogues that capture that sentiment. What I would love to see West Virginia do is lead the world in having genuine reformers seize the anti-corruption indignation that is just crackling throughout this country. And I don't know if that means that it becomes a third party, or if it becomes a really serious citizens' oversight over the two traditional parties, saying, no, you don't get our votes as a Democrat or as a Republican. Like, I agree with the Republican Party over certain issues of, personal morality or fiscal responsibility or something like that. Or I agree with the Democratic Party over certain issues of independence of women over their own choices, or over the importance of racial and ethnic diversity in our public spaces, or whatever it might be. I agree, but both of us are absolutely hard over on the issues of financial corruption, of government to serve the oligarchy, not government to serve the people. So I don't know whether that movement, that populist movement, turns into a party that can challenge the other two, or if it's one that forces integrity on the mainstream political parties.
To be determined, I guess. Thank you so much, Sarah Chayes, and we look forward to your book, Kleptocracy in America.
Thank you.
And for more information, check out sarahchayes.org. Thank you for watching This Week in Morgan County.